Sarah Boothby's garden is her sanctuary. It was a sanctuary her daughter Maeve became too ill to share. Bedbound and unable to eat, her mother cared for her right to the very end.
She didn't have the energy to feed herself. She didn't have the energy to sit up. She couldn't chew. She didn't have the energy to chew.
Do you think she knew she was dying?
She knew she was at risk of death. She definitely knew she was dying when they wouldn't help her.
Wouldn't or couldn't, Maeve Boothby O'Neill was a healthy child, but she started to suffer from ME symptoms as a teenager. Her condition rapidly deteriorated in her mid-20s, and she died at the age of 27. The inquest into her death heard evidence about a culture of disbelief amongst some of those who treated her and a lack of expertise. In an email 2 days before she died, her GP, referring to nurses, wrote, "It seems to take a variable amount of time for the penny to drop that this is ME. It can take months or not at all." An ME expert told the inquest he had written to the chief executive of the hospital in Exeter, where Maeve had been admitted and discharged on 3 occasions, warning her illness was regarded by some as her fault and that her immobility was self-inflicted. But perhaps the most telling evidence was from the medical director of the local NHS trust, who wrote, "There's a lack of a commissioned specialist service for severe, very severe ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, both locally, regionally and nationally. In order to rectify this situation, action is required at the highest level."
When I read that statement, I felt a moment of relief. I'm probably going to cry now, because one of the worst things about Maeve dying so young and wanting to contribute to the world, as she always wanted to, is that I thought at least her death won't have been in vain, that there will have been something good come out of it. Because in his statement he says what we already knew and what we were trying to overcome and failed to overcome, and he acknowledged that it is a failure. It is a failure in the health service, and it's at every level. It's not just, it's absolutely not just to do with the one hospital.
Maeve's father, Sean O'Neill, like her mother, wanted his daughter to be artificially fed. She was eventually fitted with a tube through her nose in hospital, but it was removed due to complications. Another form of feeding through a vein was said to be too dangerous. Maeve's mother told the inquest her death was wholly preventable and staff had failed in their duty of care. But a lawyer for the hospital said the trust did not accept that Maeve's death was preventable or that opportunities were missed.
That position was backed up by the coroner today. She said all the clinicians who gave evidence did believe that ME was a true illness. She described them as open-minded and respectful. She said Maeve had died from malnutrition caused by severe ME, and that doctors had been unable to treat the consequences of such a severe disease, a disease that there is still no cure for.
I'm really pleased that she has concluded that Maeve died from malnutrition caused by severe ME. It's very rare to get ME on a death certificate, but also pleased that she signalled to the hospital and I think the wider NHS that she wants to see improvements in care and treatment of ME patients in the future.
In a statement, the local NHS trust said, "Everybody involved in caring for Maeve has been profoundly impacted. We've learned from Maeve's case and strengthened the information available to staff caring for patients with severe ME." Maeve never got to walk across her beloved Dartmoor again. She died at home, her mother unable to hug her because it was too painful to be touched. Aware she was dying, she made one last plea, writing, "My only hope lies in biomedical research and adequate funding." And she called on the medical establishment to set aside the inaccurate idea that behavioural treatments can cure ME.
Jane Dodge reporting, and today the Department of Health and Social Care said that they would publish a plan this winter to help boost research and better the lives of people with ME. Earlier, I spoke to Karen Hargrave, who launched a campaign to lobby for better care for people with the condition after her husband's life was decimated by the disease. She is also an ME sufferer, and I started by asking her what her reaction was to the inquest.
Well, I'd say that I think, there's lots of us who've been following this at home, sort of people who are carers or who care for, people with ME or long COVID or who have ME or long COVID themselves. And I mean, I think I'd say that I think there's a lot of disappointment around. I think we were hoping that the conclusions would go a little bit further. But I think what I would say was that, there's still more to come in September, so I guess we'll see what happens with that. But this has never really been, I think, about just one inquest or about just one patient. And I think what's been remarkable, whatever the conclusions of this inquest, is how it sort of sparked this conversation, really, about ME and the number of people who've been following it from home, who've heard things in the inquest, testimony about ME not being believed or being dismissed or not being taken seriously, and people saying, oh, that resonates with my experience too, like this is what I've been through. Whatever the conclusions, that the conversation that this has sparked can still be a turning point in improving care for people with ME.
I mean, what do you really want? Is it the way you're treated in the system that is the real thing that you want tackling immediately?
I mean, I think there's so many different parts to it. What we're doing is we're asking for at least £100 million of annual biomedical funding for research into ME, and we're asking for that funding to be ring-fenced to make sure that that funding is delivered. We are calling for a commitment to a transformation in care for people with ME and for people with long COVID, because from what we know, around 50% of people with long COVID meet the criteria for ME as well.
You have ME, and your husband also has ME, by the sound of it, in a much more severe way. I mean, can you give us a sense of how this disease has affected you both? Because obviously some people are going to watch this and go, well, she looks all right to me.
Yeah, and I think appearances can be very deceptive. We both developed ME as a result of long COVID, and I got sick first, right at the start of the pandemic, and I was really unwell for a couple of years, sort of mostly housebound, couldn't work, and then I had this sort of quite dramatic improvement. But what I always say to people is that the way that ME affects you, it's what you can't see compared to what you can see, because when I'm at work, I work part-time now, when I'm talking to you, I look well, I look functional, but tomorrow I'm probably going to have to spend all day in bed lying down because I've been doing a couple of media interviews today. So every single thing when you have ME comes at a cost, and you kind of have to constantly make those assessments. But for James, my husband, who has been diagnosed with very severe ME, he had a very severe and quite sudden deterioration at the beginning of last year. So at the moment he's almost completely bedbound. He can sort of get out of bed once a day to go to the bathroom. He has these very, very severe cognitive difficulties. It's so bad for him that he can't, we can't have a conversation. He's not able to do the cognitive exertion that's involved in having a conversation. Like other patients with the most severe forms of ME, he's now, he has difficulty with chewing and with swallowing. So that means that basically every single day is a struggle to make sure that we're getting, the right nutrition, the right hydration into him, basically to be keeping him alive.
That must make it very difficult to engage with doctors about what he needs and what he's able to do.
We've had lots of different GPs, so we've had lots of different attitudes, but our current GP is wonderful and they do really listen to and empathise with us. But I think the difficulty is that there's just so little real understanding of ME in the NHS. So pretty much almost every single interaction I have with a healthcare worker, I basically have to explain what ME is and what very severe ME looks like and what that means for James. So I'm kind of having to go into every single one of those conversations explaining that to the healthcare professional, which is just, as a carer, it's just exhausting. It's, every single appointment, you dread it because it's an exhausting thing to have to do every single time.
Well, Karen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Christian. It was good to talk to you. Thank you.
And if you've been affected by any of the issues raised in that report, there's a range of places to seek help on channel4.com/support.